Fabulous. Well, I'm delighted to have Professor John Lennox with me today. And John is a very dear friend of mine. Those of you who follow the work of Fixed Point Foundation, who follow my work, know that we've done an awful lot together over the years. Chiefly, what the public would know, of course, is our debates with people like Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer and Christopher Hitchens and others. And John is a professor at Oxford University. John, tell us what you do there.
Well, let me first say that it's a great pleasure to be hooking up again with Fixed Point, because your interviewer is very modest today, because actually I owe him a huge debt. Those debates were absolutely crucial in giving me what I've got now, a world stage. So we go back a long way. But what I do now is I sit in my home locked down. So I'm a lockdown professor. And I'm an emeritus professor, which simply means I'm old, as you will see. And of course, I occasionally teach in Oxford, but not much now. And of course, the entire university is locked down. But my wife, Sally, and I are counted among the vulnerable as far as coronavirus is concerned. So we're not allowed to do this and that. We haven't visited our children in 12 weeks. And we're hoping that things will just ease a bit so that we get to see particularly the children, the grandchildren, and so on. But it's been a hugely productive time. And I'm, in that sense, very grateful that although I'm locked down, my mind isn't.
Yes, he has been extremely productive. I can tell you, I've been reading some of the results, and my wife Lori and I visited with them a couple of months ago in Oxford, and keep up with John's work very closely. But John has written a book, a new book titled "Where is God in a Coronavirus World?" And I suppose my first question to you, Professor Lennox, is a book like this is really about suffering, isn't it?
It is, yes, it is. And it's the hard question, therefore. Not just a hard question for Christians like myself, but a hard question for everybody. And therefore, it has to be approached with a great deal of sympathetic understanding and avoiding of attempts to give facile and simplistic answers, because there aren't any. And I wrote this book. In fact, I wrote it in a week, simply because I felt that the Christian faith has got something to say, and this thing is going to go exponentially around the world. I'm a mathematician, so at least I realized that it would become scary very fast. So I thought I'll sit down and write and see, can I give people a window of understanding? Let's put it as modestly as that. And I started on a Monday, finished on a Saturday, sent it to a publisher, and they had the print presses rolling on the following Wednesday. It was incredible. It's now in over 20 languages. So it does attempt to deal on the basis of what's going on with COVID-19 around the world, with this deep problem of suffering and evil.
Many have written about the problem of suffering. It's the question of suffering is itself as old as time. What types of suffering are there? I mean, suffering falls into a variety of categories. There's physical suffering, there's emotional suffering. Unpack for us a little bit the problem of suffering itself.
Well, suffering and evil seem to me to come from two sources, really. There's, first of all, moral evil that creates suffering. That is the bad things that people do to each other, like bombs and terrorism and so on. Then there are what is unfortunately called natural evil. Evil's a moral term, so natural evil sounds like an oxymoron. C.S. Lewis called it the problem of pain. That is the things that happen that don't necessarily involve direct human causation, like a tsunami, like a cancer, and like COVID-19. So those are two sources. But then when we think of those, there are two points of view, because it's one thing to be suffering yourself, to be inside it. It's another to watch suffering. And what I've discovered is, just by simple observation, is that many of the big questions tend to come from people who are watching suffering, but they're not in the midst of it themselves. And the deeply emotional and mental suffering questions come from people involved in it. Now, I happen to know that you have been involved in some extremely serious suffering. So I really ought to be interviewing you rather than you me on this particular occasion, because you know much more about it than I do from the inside.
Well, I like the way you address it in your book, and you do talk at a personal level, which I'll come to in a moment. But just to be clear for those who are listening to our discussion, you wouldn't equate the Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake with 9/11. How are those different? The suffering involved in both of those.
Absolutely not. I think that's a very well chosen example. 9/11 is moral evil entirely, and was caused by evil men attacking the United States of America. The Christchurch earthquake, and I arrived in Christchurch a couple of days after it happened, so everybody was asking. That has to do with physical nature of the world. And actually, there's a similarity between it and the COVID virus, because the very strange thing about our world, and that leads into a deeper question, is this, that earthquakes are caused by the shifting of tectonic plates. Now, they move, and if they didn't, there'd be no oxygen in the atmosphere. So they're absolutely vital for life. A similar thing is true of viruses. There are billions of viruses out there. Very few of them are pathogens like COVID-19, and they're essential for life as well. So we've got this strange fracture. I like to put it this way, Larry, that human nature gets fractured and you get 9/11. Physical nature gets fractured and you get COVID-19. So there's a link, and we can pursue it later, but I believe that the moral evil and the natural disasters are connected, at least originally.
Perhaps this is a speculative question, but is there an element of moral evil in the coronavirus?
Oh, I think so. If that is, I'm not a medic, but I do listen carefully to what they say, and some of the top people in the World Health Organization have made the point that the most likely origin of COVID-19 is in a market selling wild animals, very expensive wild animals that are regarded as a Chinese delicacy. Now, what I read in a technical report, not in a popular report, is that if you put animals and take them out of their normal habitat where they're free to roam and put them in a cage, they get stressed, they get very nervous, and they start to excrete. And they excrete all kinds of viruses. And that's how it happened. Now, why were they in those cages? Because somebody wanted to make a lot of money. So in that sense, you could trace it originally to greed. But then, of course, the scene changes, because as it spreads around the world, we're not to assume that everybody gets it is desperate to infect somebody else and kill them. But there is a connection. And you see that everywhere, that greed for wood, say, timber, leads to deforestation, and that leads to desertification and can lead to famine. So you get a natural disaster coming from a moral disaster. The physical breakdown leads, the moral breakdown leads to the physical breakdown. So we can't separate them too much.
Well, and And then you add to that the fact that it seems to be fairly well documented that the Chinese government suppressed knowledge of this, and
I fear so.
certainly both within and without their own country. There's a
And that,
question,
of course, is moral evil. Yep.
absolutely. There's a question I like to ask those who would presume to speak on the question of suffering. And some years ago, you may recall this, but I was chairing a debate at the University of North Carolina between Bart Ehrman, the
Yes.
well-known agnostic Bible scholar,
Yes.
his role there, and Dinesh D'Souza, who is a Christian and who's well known in this country, chiefly for writing on political questions. But the topic for that evening, in a packed house at North Carolina, the facility held, I think, 1,300 people, and it was wall to wall. And the topic was suffering. And the thought occurred to me: we're sitting in a room where there are undoubtedly many people in this room who have known extraordinary suffering.
Yes.
So during the Q&A, I turned to both of them and I said, "Gentlemen, have either of you suffered?" And I appreciated their honesty in answering. Both said no. And I unwittingly took the air right out of that debate with that single question. You could almost feel that their responses, honest though they were, that those who are listening decided, I'm not sure they have anything to offer me henceforth.
Yes.
As sufferers, we want to hear from other sufferers. So I ask you this question: have you known suffering in your life?
Mm-hmm. Not a great deal, and I leave aside sitting in a dental chair. But in the sense of facing the ultimate question, and that is the death question. Yes, I faced that. I've been in a situation where I said goodbye to my wife. I had to, because the medics didn't give me a chance. They thought I was going to be wiped out in the next few minutes by a massive heart attack. And of course, that is compressed in time. It all happened very fast. I got some pain in the weeks leading up, and then the pain became intense. And there was that, but it was the mental thing that was much bigger. And I said goodbye to my wife, and they operated and saved my life. I didn't have a heart attack. But the very interesting thing that I learned there, and it's hugely important, is that I had complete peace, because I knew that if I died where I was going, I knew I'd see my wife again. And it's almost as if, I'm going to put this in a crude way, God does his stuff at the point and the moment of deep need. And I suspect you have known that even more, and many times over.
Well, and you've witnessed a fair amount of suffering, haven't you? I mean, you just mentioned that you were in New Zealand at Christchurch just a couple of days after the earthquake there. You
Yes.
spent an awful lot of time in Eastern Europe, where you saw people before the collapse of the Soviet Union, where you saw people suffering the oppression of that government. Then, of course, you grew up very near Belfast,
Yes, I
and
did.
saw much that went on there. So you have witnessed a lot, haven't you?
Oh, yes, I watched my brother, who was nearly killed in a terrorist bomb. But I suppose the worst of it, Larry, is visits to concentration camps like Auschwitz and so
Mm,
on, and talking to the survivors of
mm,
those things. That really, I've never come out of Auschwitz without crying. It's just
mm.
an unbelievable situation. But you're right, we witness it and we need to think about it. And as you say, many people have written about it, like Dostoevsky, like um, Simon Wiesenthal, and so on. And we learn little things. But I wouldn't say that I had a PhD in the University of Suffering. I think you got one.
Well, you're certainly qualified to address the topic of suffering, is really what I'm getting at here. But your response leads me to jump way ahead in the questions that I've prepared, because you're you're nibbling at, the bigger issue here. I've been reading the last couple of days. I have been reading Graham Greene, the great British novelist, and
Sure.
Greene is his novels are quite secularly minded, but there's also, like Evil and Law, an element where he's wrestling with the question of God, which comes through in his writing. And one of his characters, which doesn't reflect his own worldview, but I think it reflected a previous godless worldview that Greene held, he says this. He says, "Can't you see what hope there would be if everybody in the world knew that there was nothing else but what we have here? No future compensation, rewards, or punishments. Then we begin to make this world like heaven." You don't agree with that, do you?
Not really. I find it is tragic because he was a novelist. He understood something about the condition humaine, and he must be aware that there's a longing in every human heart. You know the phrase, God has set eternity in our hearts, that there's something more. This can't be all that there is. And to come to the conclusion that this world is all there is, that is the atheist conclusion, of course. And it's one response to COVID-19. Look, this just shows that the universe is, as Dawkins puts it, what you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, and no justice. But there's the end of morality and an absolute end of hope. And I often say, because you and I have many atheist friends, I often say, look, you may think you've solved the problem, but actually you haven't. The suffering's still there, but you've removed all hope. You've got absolutely no ultimate hope. Because I remember in one of the debates, I think this came up, and Dawkins says, well, I hope to leave the world a better place or something like this. Well, I said, that's marvelous, but you've no ultimate hope. And I think that people in this situation today, they're really looking for a solid hope, a sure and certain hope, as the creed says. And that's why I want to come in on the side of Christianity, because I believe it has got this to offer to people. The title of my book, Where's God in the Coronavirus World? I'm tempted to say to some people when they ask me that question directly, where was God in your world before the coronavirus? And that can evoke a very interesting response. Were you searching for him? Had you found him? Have you been walking with him? Or are you just in Europe, that is, a member of the generation that doesn't want God in their lives? Because I want to tell you that God is in a coronavirus world exactly where he was before. He's offering you a relationship with himself that coronavirus can't touch, and try to get into a conversation about that.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. This idea in this Greene quotation that there would be hope. And again, this isn't Greene's view at this point of his writing.
No.
He's setting up an argument with himself through this particular character. But there would be hope if this world is all there is. I agree with you 100% that if this world is all there is, there's absolutely no hope. And mentioning our debates, I recall Christopher Hitchens, just a month before I debated him in Billings, Montana, saying from the stage while I was moderating his debate with David Berlinski, he turns and says, if I were to tell Larry that the God that he so fervently believes in, he was referencing our Bible study together, driving through the Shenandoah as we're studying St. John's Gospel. And if I were to tell Larry that the God he so fervently believes in is a figment of his imagination, it would have to destroy his hope. And I turned to him at the end of the debate and I said, I must admit that what Christopher said is 100% true, because it would say there is no hope. There's nothing beyond this world. And there are those who want to say that suffering disproves the existence of God. I would say that suffering has no meaning if there is no God. It's
exactly.
Just simply what happens.
And that's very important. And I think many people do not realize that. The older atheists, like Nietzsche, they saw that very clearly and articulated it. But the newer ones, so to speak, are not clear enough on that. I think we have a duty to explain to them, don't get on that bus uh, if you see where it's going, over a cliff.
Absolutely. You say this in the book, and I loved your response to this, but you're raising what to me seems very evident throughout this entire pandemic. You say this: how we respond to coronavirus will inevitably depend on our perspective and worldview. Now that this has moved so rapidly, and you wrote this book 3 months ago, with moving on from that 3 months, would your response be the same to that? In other words, are you seeing that worldview is being exposed in the way people are responding to the pandemic?
I think so. And one of the very interesting things in the UK is this: churches are closed. So they've gone into cyberspace. The congregations are huge. Some churches are reporting tenfold and 20-fold increase. And I understand that last week, now I have no verification of this, that a quarter of the nation attended a virtual church service. That's like wartime. That hasn't happened for years and years. What does that mean? It means that coronavirus is doing something. In the book, I refer to an incident in the life of Jesus that illustrates this whole thing. And if I might briefly mention it, it's when he was in the Temple Mountain and somebody in the crowd says, "Oh, you realize that this is where Pilate massacred a group of people that worship in the temple?" And Jesus said, "Yes. And there was another group of 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell. Do you think they were worse than anybody else in Jerusalem?" Now, this is hugely interesting because you get judgmental people who say that God is judging the world and he's judging these individuals by coronavirus. I would want to be very careful with that because Jesus himself has pointed out, and of course, it was a massacre of a few people. 18 people, the tower collapsed. The first one was moral evil, the second natural evil. But he's saying when you see that kind of thing, it's not necessarily the case that God is judging them. But then he added this, and this is what's relevant to your question. He said, "Except you all repent, you will likewise perish." Now, of course, he's not telling us we have only two possibilities of exiting this world. Either we get massacred in church or a tower collapses on us. But what he is saying is, think of how people respond to seeing this. They see death in large numbers. Proportionately, we're about the biggest in the world. We're worse than the USA, so far as I can work out. 40,000 deaths already. And you can't think of death without thinking of eternity, and you can't think of eternity without thinking about God. And C.S. Lewis said years ago that pain is God's megaphone. It's a wake-up call. And I think we're seeing that happen. And it's waking people up to think again about this whole issue, which is another reason I wrote the book. So I wouldn't change too much. Obviously, the statistics are going crazy, but the message is exactly the same. And worldviews are being revealed. And of course, the hopelessness of atheism is revealed because a strict atheist has got absolutely nothing to say to someone who is suffering or dying from COVID-19. Absolutely nothing.
So then is it fair to say, given your scriptural reference and your response, that the pandemic like this, is it the Lord's call to repentance? Is that an element of this?
Well, inevitably, I think. Some people say, this is a plague or a pestilence, like in Egypt in the Old Testament. And I say, careful here again, because we have scripture telling us about the plagues in Egypt, so we know what they were. As far as I know, we got no scripture on COVID-19. So going back to what Jesus himself said, I think we're in safe ground saying, look, you can deduce from this that people who are victims are not necessarily suffering because of something they've done. Notice the word necessarily, because it is the case that people can suffer because of what they've done. They can inflict it on themselves, actually. But what is the case is it raises this. You are vulnerable. You are mortal. You're not in control. You thought you'd got it all sussed out. So did the governments and the medics, and they haven't. And therefore, you need to think about your relationship with God. And it moves in that direction. So it's a call to repentance. I think that's a very good way of putting it.
A few nights ago, I led a discussion of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World novel that you're very familiar with. And I've read it several times before, but, in preparation, I was going through it again. And one of the things that really struck me where Huxley seems to have really anticipated where the world is going. The book was written in 31 and published in 32. And that is that death is removed from the life experiences of people. And we've done that in so many ways with our nursing homes, with
Yes, we have.
with medications, we've made it so clinical so that people are not faced with their mortality. And it seems to me that, to your point, that this pandemic has confronted people with the reality of their mortality. And of course, that raises questions of, spiritual questions, which can't help but be good, and perhaps make people to turn to the Lord in this. Let me shift gears just a bit and ask you a couple of questions, just as a scientist and as a mathematician who's there in Oxford and who undoubtedly is privy to an awful lot of conversations and information that the average individual isn't. How do you react? And again, I'm just asking your opinion. How do you react to, say, Sweden's approach to this pandemic versus what's going on in Spain and France and Britain and parts of America? They've approached it very differently. What do you make of that?
I find it very complicated to assess. In our leading papers in the last few days, they say the Swedish experiment has been a disaster because of the rate at which things are developing there. Now, I haven't had time to check that out. But what it does raise is the fact that, leaving aside the coronavirus, we're at risk every day of our lives. We take a risk if we go out in our cars. We take a risk of catching a cold, or we take a risk of cancer and all this kind of thing. And the whole difficulty here, and you can sense the reaction against it, that many people are saying, look, would you please treat us as adults and not as children, and allow us at least the freedom to decide for ourselves. And you can tell there's a growing swell of this. They're talking today that they've just got to get the sports fixtures going again. That has just been decided within the past hour here. And the difficulty is, I am not in a position to assess this, but we cannot guarantee that there's no risk. And it raises ethical, spiritual, and moral questions. For example, you can see that the principle on which governments are operating now is that the maximally important thing is to save life. Is it? Now, a number
This is where I think worldview is being exposed.
Absolutely. Absolutely, you're dead right. Because is there more to life than physical life? And if you remove everything that makes life life and put people in a box and simply keep them alive, is that a good thing to do? Well, it depends on what your view of a human being and human flourishing is. And you think of the world of the New Testament and back in time, because we've had plagues before, and they've been far worse than COVID, at least so far. The Black Death of the Middle Ages wiped out, what, 200 million people, and
Yeah.
a very high percentage of the
A
European
third of the population
population.
of Europe. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And as a historian, you know these things. And people lived in those times. And one of the most impressive things coming out of that, of course, as folks like Rodney Stark have recorded, that the Christian response amazed folks because they founded hospices and hospitals and so on. And they took the risk. And a world without risk would be a strange world. There's no athletes who don't take risks with their health and all the rest of it. So I just wonder whether the lockdown in some countries was very successful. And we must factor that in. The Prime Minister in New Zealand acted extremely swiftly. And if we had done that and had the same result, we'd have had, I worked it out the other day, less than 300 deaths rather than 40,000. That's a pretty big difference. And now they're back to normal. So, but I can't second guess these things, Larry. I find them difficult, but I do know that they are raising very big questions. Think of people losing their jobs,
Hmm.
and that would you rather risk losing your job or catching something that really for young people is very unlikely to be serious and all this kind of stuff. I can understand them protecting the oldies, but they may well have gone absolutely over the top. I just don't know.
It's very interesting, John. When all of this began, as you know, Lori and I saw you in Oxford, and then she flew home, and then I went to North Africa, and all of this was just starting at the time,
That's right.
and then from there, I was in Portugal and Spain, and the lockdown was enforced there rigorously. But when all this began in Africa, I couldn't help but think, here I am in the deserts with these African men who face daily dangers that are inconceivable to people in the West. More than 800,000 Africans die each year from malaria alone, and it
Exactly.
barely is a blip on in the headlines in the West. But they all got BBC and they all got CNN, and they, even out in the desert, here they are with their cell phones and they're wearing masks and they're terrified of the coronavirus. And here I am thinking the likelihood of these men dying from coronavirus is quite remote. And the number of horrible ways that they can die in Africa are just myriad. But that's the power of media. And that is, if every death of malaria was covered in painstaking detail, the way this has been covered, you would be terrified to leave your home ever.
Exactly. And I think getting a sense of proportion into this, I mean, the number of road deaths per annum, for
Hmm.
example, to say nothing of, as you say, malaria and everything else. I just wonder if, as you put it, we're seeing worldview coming out. What is number one? And it doesn't surprise me that Yuval Noah Harari, who's written these best-selling books in millions, the Israeli historian, and I've been writing about him because he says the number one agenda for the 21st century is the solution of physical death as a technical problem. I've just written a book about this called
Hmm.
2084, thinking of your George Orwell and
Which
so
we'll
on.
discuss later. Yes.
Yep, we will. But there's the agenda, and you can see it in people's minds that preservation of physical life is the number one thing. There are no other values because there's nothing after this life.
One more question about your book. What does the incarnation of Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, have to do with a global pandemic?
Well, I think that it has a great deal to do with it, because the fact of the incarnation raises the why question. Why did God come into the world? And number one thing that brings it near to the pandemic is this is a God who has suffered. If Jesus is the Son of God, and that's the central claim of the incarnation, then what's God doing on a cross, to put it crudely? That's the first thing. God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering. And when we look carefully at the life of Christ and his response to suffering, there are one or two incidents that really bring us very close to the coronavirus reaction. They're not in my book, actually, so far as I recall. There's a famous story of a tiny family, two women and their brother, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he gets ill. And Jesus is miles away. They send a letter saying, Lord, the one you love is ill. And of course, they expect him to come. He doesn't come, and they watch him die. Now, they believed he had the power to do something, and he stays away. And this raises the coronavirus question. Where is God? Is he in quarantine? Social distance. It was physical distance. Jesus turns up after the poor man's died, and they've gone through all the trauma of mourning. And he arrives, and Martha meets him first and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Now, that's fascinating, because it shows she believes he had the power to deal with it if he'd been present. He'd got the power, but why wasn't he present? Wasn't he willing? And this is back to David Hume and Epicurus and all these people talking about, is God willing? Well, if he's willing, then he's not able. And if he's able, then he's not willing, because he doesn't do anything. So we're right in the middle of it. And what I've learned recently from that, paying attention to that story, is Jesus says to Martha, your brother will rise again. And this was something she believed in a distant future. Yes, Lord, I know, at the resurrection of the dead. He said, no, I don't mean that, actually. I am the resurrection. Now, that must have puzzled her. What could he mean? I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Now, this is the beginning of an answer to death. And Mary arrives at this point, and she says the exact same words as her sister. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But then she starts to weep. And instead of entering into a deep theological, philosophical discussion with her, Jesus weeps too. And I think this is hugely important. Is this real weeping? Are they crocodile tears? Or is this showing us what the heart of God is like, seeing what death does to a little family? Because if it is, it's the beginnings of hope. He dealt with those two sisters according to their temperament, very different. But then he raised his voice outside the grave and said, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out. And this is, in small scale, what God promises to do for everyone that trusts him through Christ, that the hour is coming, said Jesus earlier than that, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and they will rise. And this is the huge hope that people who trust, that people that trust in Jesus have. Now, here am I. If I catch COVID in a supermarket or something, I have to go out and shop occasionally, and I die of it, that might be a tragedy for my family. But what Christianity does here is give me hope. And it's a founded hope. It's an evidence-based hope, because what is promised to those that trust Christ is that what happened to him eventually will happen to them. Jesus raised Lazarus, but he was resurrected, never to die again. And so will we. So there are two sides to it. There's the suffering, and then we, of course, we have to raise the question, why is the Son of God suffering? And that's to deal with human sin. that caused the problem in the first place, because there is a deep original connection between human disobedience and sin and physical death. And the Bible is very clear on it. Whatever you make of it, it's clear on it. As through one man, sin entered into the world, and death through sin. And so death passed upon all men, all human beings. And that's where the fracture started. And it's been flowing down ever since. So the short answer, although there isn't one to your question, is that the incarnation begins to help us to get some sort of insight into the very mind of God and what his salvation involves. And that's where my hope is placed. And that's what I wanted to say in the book, even though I haven't got all the answers. If I die of COVID-19, I will go into eternity with loads of questions. But even though I can't answer all the difficulties, and there are many, I believe I've got to know someone who is the answer, and I can trust him.
And boy, John, this is where worldview really comes out in as it pertains to a pandemic, because what you've effectively said is that because you have this hope, you don't believe that death is the worst thing that can happen to you.
No.
But if I believe that this world is all there is, this is all I get. Death is the worst thing that can happen to me, and thus the preservation of life at all costs is the first consideration. And I respond to your decision to move on with your life and to assume those risks to be something that's very, very foolish and perhaps even harmful to society. One final question, and you've teed me up quite nicely for it. Speaking of someone who will be resurrected on that day, Ravi Zacharias. He recently passed. I had lunch with Ravi on occasion and coffee with him, and did a couple of conferences with him, but I can't claim to have really known him. You did know him. You knew him quite well. You did a lot of work with Ravi. What is his legacy?
I think his legacy is that he, in a way, pioneered. And the slogan that he used was a very good one: helping the believer think and helping the thinker believe. He was a man committed to the Christian message and committed to showing to the world and to the church that Christianity is evidence-based. You don't have to commit intellectual suicide to become a Christian. So there's a legacy in what he did, and around the world, he was respected by world leaders. I watched the memorial service, and your vice president spoke at it. And that's a testimony to the measure of the esteem in which he was held. But there's another legacy he's left, and that is over 100 young people, able young people, committed to the intellectual defense of Christianity and desirous of fulfilling the Great Commission and going out into the world, and they're in many countries in the world, to get among young people and to live out Christianity and to think through Christianity and to think with them and help them to see that it is cool, if you like, to become a Christian in this contemporary world. So he's had a huge effect. And I just noticed that as I was watching the funeral memorial service, that there were 80,000 people watching it. And that number will go up. And there was a very clear message presented by a pastor at the end. So the answer to your question is he really has made a major contribution.
I agree with that, and I know tens of thousands, perhaps millions of people around the world would agree with that. John Lennox's book, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? I just want to tell our listeners, our viewers, that this is not a very big book. This is not an intimidating book. This is a very quick and easy read. You can find it on Amazon. Where else can you find it, John?
Well, the Good Book Company, it's on ebooks And as I say, for Hispanic people, it's in Spanish, it's in all kinds of languages, including Russian and Chinese. And in our country, at least, it costs less than a cup of coffee.
Well, and I would also say to potential buyers, potential readers, that its usefulness goes well beyond coronavirus. As I say, the book is really about suffering. It's not just suffering as it relates to coronavirus. Fair enough?
That's absolutely right. And in fact, the German translators noticed that. And they've called it Wo ist Gott in dieser Welt? Where is God in this world? And then just at the bottom, there's something about coronavirus. And I said, why have you done that? They said, because it applies much more widely than to this specific pandemic.
Hmm.
And what has encouraged me is people are giving it away.
Hmm.
And that's just great to hear. They have enough confidence to feel that it can stimulate conversations about the bigger implications, the worldview implications of the pandemic, and they can enter into that conversation.
Well, and I'll just also say this: John's work is appreciated all over the world. And I should tell you this: I forgot to mention it, but the God Delusion debate, the debate that we sponsored, that we put together all those years ago in 2007, just in the last month, has been subtitled into Danish. So now people can watch that debate and understand it there as well. So, Professor John Lennox, it's been a delight to have you today, and we're going to have John back. We're going to discuss 2084. You want to hold up that book very quickly? You had it sitting next to you.
Of course. Yes, of course. I can hold it up so as people can see.
There we go. It's a book on artificial intelligence, and that will be part of our next discussion. So, Professor John Lennox, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.